So our first question here is, what has happened to the female labour force participation rate in Australia since the 1970s? Okay, off to the Bureau of Statistics website we go. So that's how we can find the female labour force participation rate over the period that we were interested in. Incidentally, the Bureau of Statistics data for the labour force that's publicly available and only goes back to 1978 now. It used to go back earlier, but to get the earlier data you now have to pay money. So if we were to just look at the overall participation rate, we can see that it's fairly stable from the 1970s up to roughly now, but it has increased slightly over that time. From 1978, 62% of the working age population was engaged in the labour force. They were either employed or unemployed. But now it's 66% of the working age population who is either in work or actively seeking work. But if we subdivide that into males and females, we get very different participation rates. So if we just looked at males, we can see that in 1978, 79% of working-aged males were engaged in the labour force, were participating, either employed or unemployed. Today, however, it's 71% of working-age males. If we look at women, on the other hand, as we just saw, we get a very different picture. Female participation rate in 1978 was 43% of working-age women. But today, it's 62% of working-age women who are participating in the labour force. This is a huge change over time. Why have we seen this change? Well, there's probably a number of factors involved, a number of reasons involved. One is, for example, the introduction of the Contraceptive Pill in the 1960s, which meant that women were able to gain greater control over how many children they had. Obviously, if you're having children on a fairly regular basis, it's very difficult to gain and maintain work over any period of time. So that's one factor. Another factor is in the 1970s you get the rise of what we now call feminism. At the time was called the women's liberation movement, where you had women who started arguing that we should be rethinking gender norms. That is, it was not the case that a woman's place was in the home, barefoot and pregnant, tied to the kitchen sink. A woman should be free to choose to live her life as she sees fit in a similar way that men have a degree of choice in that. Some degree of economic autonomy, for example, would be part of that, and that entails working to earn an income, to have an independent income. So this movement started to gain a degree of traction with respect to law and also with respect to social norms. So it became socially acceptable for women to go out to work. And it also became, there were changes in laws that were made to enable that to occur. So, for example, it used to be the case that in the public service, for example, if a woman got married, who was working in the public service, got married, she was automatically sacked. As a matter of regulation, she was sacked. Obviously, that was eventually abolished. The idea of maternity leave simply didn't really exist, and the idea of paid maternity leave certainly didn't exist. So these are changes that gradually occurred over time, which facilitated women being able to move into and participate in the labour force. On top of the fact that, especially during periods of economic hardship, women will be forced to seek work to try and supplement household income. And certainly as the real wages of the quote-unquote, what used to be called the breadwinner of the household, was not increasing at a very substantial rate, and as more debts were taken on, for example, for mortgages and so on, it was the case that you needed two breadwinners. It's interesting, however, to note that this increase in the female participation rate has, to a very large extent, been in part-time work. And we can see that if we look at the next graph here. We can see that the proportion of women in employment who are in full-time jobs has declined, whereas employment in part-time jobs has increased over time. So this indicates that the increase in women's participation in the labour market has predominantly been in part-time employment. Incidentally, this trend to part-time employment is not just about women. To some extent, you see the same thing with men, but not as pronounced. So, in the case of male full-time work, in 1978, for the men who were employed, 95% of them were full-time employees, and 5% were working part-time. Today, 81% of men who are employed are full-time employed, and 19% are part-time employed. But of course, this is chicken feed compared to the trend with respect to women's employment, where it used to be 34% of employed women were part-time workers. Today, it's 46% of employed women are part-time workers. All right, how is it possible for the participation rate and the unemployment rate to both go up in some months, but in other months, the participation rate goes up and the unemployment rate goes down? How can this possibly be? Well, let's figure out the answer to this question with the ratios that we now know about. We'll start with the participation rate. The participation rate is the labour force divided by the working age population. Now, the labour force is composed of all the people who are employed plus all the people who are unemployed. That's our first ratio. Our second ratio is the unemployment rate. So this is the total number of people who are unemployed divided by the labour force. And the labour force is made up of, as we just saw, the total number of people employed plus the total number of people unemployed. So this is our second ratio. So our first question is, how is it that the first ratio can be going up and the second ratio can be going up? Well, for this first scenario, it could be that we have new entrants into the labour market and they're seeking work, but they become unemployed. They don't find work. What impact would that have on these two ratios? So unemployment would go up, and let's say the number of people employed stays the same and the working age population stays the same. So unemployment goes up here, and so that one's got to do the same over here. Unemployment goes up, employment stays unchanged. Now, if that's true, what happens to this ratio overall? Well, the numerator is increasing, the denominator is remaining unchanged. So overall, this fraction will go up. What about this one? We've got the numerator going up and the denominator going up as well. But when we have the numerator and the denominator going up by the same amount, when they're not the same numbers, overall this will go up. Let's give an example just to illustrate the point. Let's say initially that the number of people employed was 10 million and the number of people unemployed was, say, 1 million. And let's say the working age population was 20 million. So this would be, so that's 11 over 20, that's around about 55%. So the participation rate's 55% initially. And we've got the unemployment rate. So the number of unemployed in this story is 1 million. The number of employed is 10 million, plus the unemployed 1 million. So that's 1 over 11. So that's around about 9%. All right, now what we want to do is say the unemployment goes up and nothing else changes. So number of people employed stays the same. Let's say unemployment goes from 1 million people to 2 million people. Working age population stays the same. So that's 12 over 20. So that's 60%. What about the unemployment rate? Unemployment increased to 2 million. The number of employed stayed the same. So this gives us 2 over 12. So that's rounded off 17%. So you can see by increasing the unemployment, the number of people unemployed, we get an increase in the participation rate from 55 to 60% and an increase in the unemployment rate from 9 to 17%. Scenario 2 was one in which we were saying that how could it be that the participation rate could go up but the unemployment rate could go down? Well, that could be because we have new entrants coming in, but they might immediately gain employment. So, for example, it could be that there are job vacancies that will be filled by new graduates who are particularly trained for that particular kind of work. So we'd have an increase in employment, and let's assume nothing else changes. In that case, for here, we get an increase in the numerator, no change in the denominator, so we get an increase in this ratio. Unemployment remains unchanged, employment goes up. So what happens to this ratio? The numerator stays the same, the denominator gets bigger, so this ratio would get smaller. All right, so just to illustrate it, again, we'll do a little example. And then, let's say, new entrants come in who immediately gain work. So that's 11 million employed, unemployed stays the same. Working age population stays the same. Participation rate goes up from 55 to 60%. What about the unemployment rate? 1 million people remain unemployed, but now there's 11 million who are employed, plus the unemployed. So then we get an unemployment rate of 8%. So you can see the unemployment rate fell from 9 to 8%. So this is a way in which you can have participation rate going up and the unemployment rate going down, in contrast to scenario 1.